Hello and welcome to another tier list video. Today we are taking a look at the Summer Olympic events. I'm super excited for the Summer Olympics. Really sad that they got canceled last summer, but glad that we're at least gonna have something to see this summer. I definitely prefer watching the Summer Olympics over Winter Olympics. There's just a lot more sports that I enjoy watching. I don't have every single event on here. There are a few that I've excluded because I've either never watched them or I've only watched like part of one event and don't really feel like I can give a good review, but all of these I've seen, at least a handful of times on the Olympics. So starting us off, we have badminton. Now, as I've mentioned before, I'm a huge badminton fan. I love playing badminton, and watching it is no different. I mean, these guys, they're the best of the best, and when you are watching a sport where they're playing that well, that you like to play as well, it's just fun to watch. So badminton, really enjoy watching this one. It's going to be up in the A tier for me. Up next, we have basketball, which, is another sport that I like to play, I like to watch, and Olympic basketball is always super fun because you get to see all these players who normally don't play together on the same team. So the USA team is always completely stacked, and you get to see some of the players in the NBA from other countries go back to their countries and play with the players from their team. So it's always really cool, just kind of fun to see that different mix of players. It's so different from NBA or other professional basketball associations, and I just really love watching this one. Basketball for me gonna be up in the S tier. Up next, we have beach volleyball. This is another sport that I think is super fun to watch. There's some people who they definitely like watching women's volleyball for a different reason. But for me, beach volleyball, it's just so fun. Compared to volleyball where there's 6 people, beach volleyball just seems so much more difficult with only 2 people to, bump set spike. And of course, the dives, when they dive, it's so cool. They make it look so much better than when I tried it at, a beach where I'm playing beach volleyball. Super fun sport to watch, though. It's crazy, how they can dive and then already be back on their feet, spiking it over the net in like 2 seconds. Super fun to watch. Beach volleyball, gonna be another S tier for me. And now we have regular volleyball, which, as I mentioned before, 6 people indoors. I'm not as huge of a fan of this one. It's not as crazy and wild as beach volleyball with people diving left and right because, if you dive indoors, it's pretty painful, and people still do it, but it's just not quite as cool and quite as impressive compared to beach volleyball for me. Of course, these people are still insane, but indoor volleyball, 6 players, I'm really not a huge fan of it. It's only going to find itself in the C tier. Up next, we have boxing, which is one that I really haven't watched too many times, but in the Olympics, it's always pretty interesting. Not a sport that I would want to play. I'm not a huge fan of getting punched in the face over and over again, but in the Olympics, it's still pretty interesting to watch. It is one that, I'll watch if it's on TV, but usually I won't really seek out and try to watch this event, so boxing, gonna be another C tier for me. Up next, we have the baseball and softball for women's. Baseball in general isn't a sport that I really love to watch. I don't mind going to an occasional baseball game, but it's not really a sport that I like watching on TV for the MLB. And the Olympics is really no different. Not a huge fan of watching it. It is still fun, similar to basketball, where you have a lot of players returning to their countries, playing on completely different teams with entirely new players that they've, probably not played with for a long time, if at all. So I do like that aspect, and that makes it a bit interesting, but again, I don't love it, but still good enough to find itself in the B tier for me. Up next, we're getting into the cyclings. Some of these I like a lot more than others. The first one is the cycling mountain bike, which is probably one of my favorite ones. This one, they're basically on a pretty long course. And these races, I want to say they last like over an hour sometimes. So they're pretty long, mountain bike races. And it's basically, if you've been mountain biking, you probably understand what it's about. They go through this track and there's, a bunch of hills where they go up, down, it's a dirt track. It's pretty fun to watch, kind of scary because some of the hills are like crazy steep and I think I'd probably die if I tried biking down them. But it is fun to watch and really impressive how they can even, stay upright on their bike when they're, traversing these crazy terrains. So it is a fun one to watch, but again, not my favorite biking one, but it's up there. So it's going to find itself in a solid B tier. Up next, we have the cycling track, where this is the indoor one where they're all wearing the super aerodynamic helmets and clothes. This one I'm not a huge fan of, honestly. It's very linear. If you like NASCAR racing, you might like this one, I guess, because it's kind of the same thing, just people going in an oval. and people passing, occasionally really slowly. Although I will say there's a decent amount of passing in, indoor cycling because the person in front is always cycling like to the back of the pack. But this one I'm not a huge fan of, honestly. It's probably my least favorite way to watch cycling, and it's going to find itself down in the D tier. Up next we have road cycling, which is kind of similar to track cycling, except it's not quite as fast and it's outdoor, of course. This is more so kind of what you think of with the Tour de France kind of races. That's kind of more so what this is, but once again, I'm not a huge fan of it. I would say I slightly prefer it to the indoor cycling, so it's going to find itself in kind of a low C tier. And then up next we have the cycling BMX. This is by far the most exciting one for me. The races are pretty short, the tracks are pretty short, and basically these guys are on these like small BMX bikes, and they're just going over this crazy track that has like a ton of just like jumps, bumps, turns, like crazy turns where they're at like a 45-degree angle. I mean, this thing is intense, and the race is pretty short, so it's easy to just sit down and watch the whole event, whereas a lot of these other cycling events, they can get pretty long, so I'm not as huge of a fan of those. But BMX cycling one, it's like a few minutes and it's over, and it's exciting the whole time. Sometimes people wipe out and it's crazy, so this one, definitely a fun one to watch. If you haven't seen it, I recommend it. Gonna find itself up in the A tier. Up next, we have diving. Now, I'm a bit biased because I was a swimmer, so I like watching the diving a little more than others, but the diving is always so impressive for me. I mean, just the amount of flips they do and just how high they're able to jump off. I mean, these diving boards are insanely high up. Like, I'm not even sure I could do a pencil dive without wiping out going off these jumps, or these diving boards. And for me, that makes it really exciting. It's really fun to watch, really enjoy it. Diving for me, gotta be up in the S tier. Up next, we have fencing. Now, this is one that I was excited to watch the first time I did, but I was a little bit less satisfied than I was hoping. It's still exciting to watch, but for me, because I haven't really watched fencing that much, it's hard for me to identify when they actually like get tagged out and like get hit. And so they'll usually just be like fencing, and then all of a sudden it's done, and I'm like, I didn't even see them actually, win, basically. So, but I think that's more so just because I don't really know what's going on in fencing, and I can't really identify when they've actually been hit. So fencing, it's cool, but I feel like I need to understand it and be able to see it a little more before I can appreciate it. So it's still fun to watch, but not my favorite, and it's going to find itself in the C tier. Up next, we have football, or for us Americans, soccer. This is another one that's pretty fun to watch. I'm not a huge fan of watching soccer as a sport, but similar to baseball and basketball, it's always fun to see people playing with their country rather than their club that they normally play with. So it's pretty exciting, but for me, it's kind of like baseball and softball. Still not a huge fan of watching it on TV, so it's gonna find itself only in the B tier. Up next, we have golf. Now this is another sport. I don't mind playing golf. I'll play usually a couple times this summer, but watching it on TV, whether it's PGA Tour, Masters, or the Olympics, I'm just not really a huge fan of it. It's too slow paced for me, and I'd rather just play it than watch it. So golf, honestly, gonna be down in the D tier. Up next, we have the gymnastics artistic. Now this is the one where they're performing, the different moves, doing tricks on like the balance beam, the monkey bars, I guess. I'm not sure what the technical terms are for all those things, but this one is pretty fun to watch. Watching them do all the flips and watching them land without wobbling is always exciting. So it's a pretty fun one to watch. Not my favorite. Usually, I'll watch an event or two of this each Olympics and I'll be satisfied, but it's still pretty fun to watch, at least for a little bit, and it'll find itself in the B tier. Up next, we have the gymnastics rhythmic one. This is where they usually have the big, like, basically square, mat, and they're pretty much just doing tricks on that. They're running around. You can see here sometimes they have like the streamers. They run around and do their routine to the music. This one I'm not really a huge fan of. I like to dance, so you think I'd like watching this one because it's kind of like a dance, but I'm really not a huge fan of it. And most importantly, I like to be able to understand what's going on in the event, and I can never understand whether or not they're doing a good job. Like, the artistic gymnastics, it's pretty easy to understand, if they fall or if they mess up a flip or if they don't stick the landing. It's pretty clear that they did well or didn't do well. Gymnastics rhythmic, sometimes I watch it, I'm like, wow, that was super good, and then they get like a bad rating. So Not a huge fan of this one, honestly, but again, kind of like fencing, I just don't understand it that well, and it's only going to find itself down in the D tier. Up next, we have handball. Now, this sport is actually super intense. If you've never watched handball, I recommend watching it. It is super fun to watch at the Olympic level. Even if you don't understand, it's exciting. And if you do understand it, it's even better. I've played handball a few times, and I love playing it. Honestly, fun to watch, fun to play. Handball, gonna be up in the A tier. Up next, we have artistic swimming. I always thought of this as, synchronized swimming. It's definitely interesting, and people can do some pretty crazy stuff in the water. But for me, it's kind of like gymnastics rhythmic, where sometimes, I'm watching them, I'm like, whoa, they're doing super good, they're all super synced. And then they don't even get a good score, so I'm not a huge fan of this one. It's, it's cool to watch for a couple minutes, but for me, I've seen one routine, I say I've seen them all. So artistic swimming, gonna be down in the D tier, unfortunately. Up next, we have swimming. Now, of course, as I mentioned before, I was a swimmer. I'm super biased. I love watching swimming. My favorite events to watch, watching Michael Phelps back in his Olympics that he competed in was so much fun. And swimming, for me, I can't put it anywhere but the S tier. Probably my favorite event to watch in the Olympics, for the Summer Olympics, that is. Up next, we have rugby. Rugby is a pretty fun one to watch, honestly. It's pretty much just like a more brutal version of American football in some ways. You're not getting hit quite as hard because you're not wearing the pads, but you're not wearing pads. And I have some friends who played rugby in college, and they had some pretty nasty injuries. And I can tell you, I will never play rugby because of that. But watching people play rugby is pretty fun. It's not my favorite. It's it's exciting, but it's a sport where I watch 1 or 2 games of rugby each Olympics, and that's usually enough for me. So fun to watch, but not one I need to watch too much. It's gonna find itself in the B tier. Up next, we have rowing. This one, I'll be honest, is not that exciting. Not to knock away, how difficult the sport is and how much strength it takes, but it's just not that exciting to watch. I mean, it's pretty much just people rowing for, X amount of time. And sure, sometimes the races are really close, but usually by like 2/3 of the way through the race, you can kind of see who's pulling ahead. And usually, unless another team has like a really strong second wind, they're just gonna win. So it's not really the edge of your seat kind of sport for me. And not too much like skill expression or creativity. It's really just like raw strength from my understanding. You rowers out there, you can correct me on this, but I'm just not a huge fan of watching it. So rowing, I'm sorry for you rowers out there, but this one is actually gonna find itself in the F tier. Up next, we have sailing, which for me is, kind of similar to rowing. Usually you can tell who's going to win by about the 2/3 mark. Sometimes they are pretty close. If you haven't watched sailing before, it's kind of interesting. It's pretty much just one guy on his sailboat, and they basically race across usually the ocean from one point to another. And it's kind of interesting, watching them like do different things on the sailboat. And if you've seen it, it's kind of weird how they sit. They sit like on the edge of the sailboat, with like just pretty much their thighs and down actually on the boat, and like the rest of their upper body is like hanging off the edge. It's kind of weird, but I'm sure there's strategy to it. I'm sure there's a reason why it's done like that. So I will say this one's a bit more interesting than rowing for me, but still not a huge fan. Gonna find itself in the D tier. Up next, we have shooting, which for me is a pretty fun one to watch. So for shooting, there's a couple different ones. There's like handgun, rifle, and trap shooting. I might be missing another one. You can let me know if I am. But I'm definitely most interested in trap shooting. That one is always crazy, especially the double trap shooting. I'm not even sure if they're single trap shooting. I've only seen the double. Basically, they shoot out 2 of those clay discs, and they have to shoot both of them. That one for me is super exciting because I've tried it before, and it is really, really hard. And so it's just super fun to watch people do that. The static shooting, where they're just shooting at a target, isn't quite as exciting for me, but it's still pretty cool. And for me, shooting gonna find itself up in the A tier. Up next, we have archery. This one is pretty similar to shooting for me. It's always, static. They're not shooting at moving targets. As far as I know, if they are, let me know, and I'd love to watch that. But I think it's just the static target shooting for archery. And I think this one is a lot of fun to watch. I've shot bows before, and I think it's a lot of fun. It's an impressive sport. It's really hard to do, and just a fun one to watch. Gonna find itself up in the A tier as well. Up next, we have skateboarding, which this is another one that's just really fun to watch. If you like watching, half pipe snowboarding in the winter, you'll probably like watching skateboarding. Of course, it's not the same, but there's definitely similarities there. And skateboarding for me, just another fun one to watch. Gonna find itself up in the A tier. Up next, we have hockey. Now, I'm pretty much just going to mirror the same things that I said about the baseball, softball, and football events. It's cool to watch players playing on different teams, with their country instead of their organization. But I'm not a huge hockey fan. I've never really been a fan of watching hockey or playing hockey. So for me, it's still fun to watch at the Olympic level, but don't absolutely love it. Hockey going to find itself in kind of a mediocre B tier for me. Up next, we have table tennis. Now, I love playing table tennis, and table tennis at the Olympic level is honestly one of the most fun sports to watch. I mean, these guys are standing like way behind the table, and they're just slamming the ball back and forth like so quickly. I mean, it is insane watching these guys play. I don't even know how they can react that fast and how they can hit it so perfectly to land like on the edge of the table, the other person. Love watching table tennis. If you've never watched Olympic table tennis, you need to watch it. This sport is intense, honestly. Definitely an S tier for me. Up next, we have tennis. Tennis is another sport that, I've watched it in the Wimbledon, I've watched it in the Olympics, and I'm just never a huge fan. I definitely prefer watching singles tennis over doubles, just because watching single is like crazy with how much they're running back and forth. It's moderately fun to watch, but it's not my favorite sport, and for that reason, it's gonna find itself in another middle of the road B tier. Up next, we have water polo. Once again, being a swimmer, I'm gonna be a bit biased. We used to play water polo back in our practices some days, and I love playing water polo, and watching it is fun as well. It's super hard work playing the sport, like treading water pretty much the whole time, but water polo, definitely super fun to play, super fun to watch. Gonna find itself in the S tier as well. Up next, we have weightlifting. Honestly, I might not look like it, but I like lifting weights. But watching weightlifting is one of the most boring things for me. Like, it's pretty much either they're gonna lift it or they're not. Like, obviously it's a pure form of strength, but there's not really much like skill expression. It's pretty much just, you're doing your weights. You know how to lift it. Just do you have the muscle to do it? For me, it's pretty boring. Sure, it's cool watching people like break the world records, at the Olympics for weightlifting, but it's just not fun to watch for me, and for that reason, it's going to be another F tier. Last but not least, we have the two new sports. These will be the first time they've ever been Olympic events, is at the 2021 Tokyo Olympics. I have watched these, kind of outside the Olympics because, of course, they've never been in them yet. But I am really excited for these. We have sport climbing and surfing. So starting off with sport climbing, I think there's 3 versions. There's speed climbing, where there's like a pretty short wall. Short, I say. It's usually, 15, 20 feet maybe. I'm not sure about the exact measurements. And basically, it's 2 people racing to see who can get to the top and touch a pad first. That one is super fun to watch because it's insane, like how fast they can climb up this wall. And then there's also like sport climbing, where basically they just see how far can they climb up the wall while attached to a rope without, falling. That one's also pretty cool to watch as well. I've seen some videos. And then the last one is bouldering, where they're not harnessed in, but they just have to climb up a shorter wall, but it's super hard. And basically they get judged based on, how many bouldering puzzles can they complete. And honestly, I think it's a lot of fun. I've rock climbed quite a bit in college. I did a decent amount of bouldering, and I think it's going to be fun. I think it's going to be a good addition. Well, I haven't seen it at the Olympic level. I did watch the trials for it, and I thought it was super cool. So sports climbing, I think, going to be an A tier for me. And then lastly, we have surfing, which is one that I'm really excited for as well. I've always enjoyed watching surfing when it's on TV occasionally. And this is another one I watched the qualifiers for, and it's just cool. I'm excited for surfing. I think it's going to be a great addition to the Summer Olympics. And for me, haven't seen it in the Olympics yet, but I think it's going to be another A tier. Well, that's my list. I hope you guys enjoyed, and let me know your thoughts.